Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Sean, I appreciate it.
Yeah, man. So I know you're going through COVID right now, and I appreciate you, coming on. And I offered to reschedule, but I get it that you're a true champion, and I appreciate that. The first thing I'd like to know is, what does your climb look like? How did you get here?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you. I think I'm out of the woods at this point, so it's not horrible. I'm not trying to get too many sympathy points, but basically, I moved to New York in like 2010, and I always joke that like if you don't know what you want to do and you're in New York, you kind of just end up in like the rubble heap of the agency world. So I started out there. I was on the account side. I was working. I was like literally the guy that would be on the other side of a Facebook wall answering problems with like broken headphones or people saying they bought counterfeit electronics for a certain client of ours, and pitching stuff. And eventually just kind of fell into a split sales client service role at an animation studio. So I was the first hire there just from a Craigslist ad. Basically got hired at an animation studio, and was kind of doing that classic agency sales client service shuffle. Tried every tactic under the sun, eventually got some sales coaching and ended up getting on probably like thousands and thousands of sales calls, and kind of learned how to do it. And kind of help them grow, help them go from 0 to 7 figures. We were selling like explainer videos and commercials to the Fortune 500 world and tech startups and so on. And then, in very like cliche fashion, got into 4-hour work week and all that stuff, and like quit my job and traveled to Asia with my girlfriend at the time, and self-published a couple business books about everything that I had accomplished at the job. Self-published an account management book, and then started a company called Sales Schema, which I'm still running, in around 2014. And it started out as kind of a consultancy focused on sales and new business. And I realized pretty early on that the people that saw expertise in me were agencies, like boutique marketing agencies, and that all of them had the same problem, which was kind of an over reliance on referrals and personal networks, and never having had to go through the motions of actually like building a scalable new business channel. So I realized that the way to help, was doing outreach and basically helping them keep the pipeline full. And the rest is history. So we've sort of been working at that since about 2014. And what we're doing now is doing outreach on behalf of our clients to, make sure the pipeline's full and make sure new business is good, regardless of how busy or not busy they are. So that's kind of where we're at now.
So what does the perfect prospecting process look like for agencies?
It's such a good question, and I wish there was just one. I think that again, like our focus is definitely on outreach, and we're big believers in in both inbound and outbound. But outbound is something that should be a part of the arsenal at any given time. And I think that as opposed to process, it's it will definitely is process, but as opposed to like any given tactic, rather. It's more about thinking about who's doing it and the consistency of it, and really having the mindset of it being like going to the gym or eating healthy or anything else you should be doing, as opposed to what we see so much where it tends to be like something that agencies are doing as a hobby or when they have time. So I think, like anything, I know it's kind of cliche, but consistency is key. Beyond that, I think that what's been effective has changed a lot. I think that there was a point where you really could do outreach directly and say, hey, look, Mr. and Ms. CMO, look at my case studies. I'm so awesome. Let me pitch you. And that would produce reliable meetings and close business. And it still does. Sometimes there is a place to be direct. So I'm speaking in broad strokes, but I think that's gotten harder because there's a lot more solutions, whether it's an agency competing with you or freelancers or whatever. But there's also just a lot more competition for attention. And especially now with basically everybody that was budgeting for trade shows and whining and dining is now having to figure out how to sell digitally, which really means in B2B, like a few different channels, LinkedIn, email, phone, maybe. So there's a real traffic jam effect. So what we tend to do for clients is instead of going through this like exhaustive chasing people around game, it's more about identifying the people that are likely to talk to our clients to begin with, based on a personal and or business commonality. So really going towards personalization. And that's kind of how we're thinking about it, and can definitely go further down that rabbit hole.
All right, my paws are ready to dig. Let's go down that rabbit hole. So yeah, what do you mean in the personalization thing? Are you leveraging technology, or is this more of a manual process? Can you say more about it?
Yeah, a little bit of both. So it's thinking more creatively. And for example, like we have campaigns going now where we had a client a while back that was actually a foreign-based agency. They're based in Hamburg, Germany. The founders originally from Argentina. and they're selling web design, web development services in the six-figure realm to Fortune 500 software companies. And it's like about the hardest sell you could think of. The salesperson at English is a second language, and you can't just say, "Hey, like buy a six-figure website from us." Like everybody's selling that. It's one of those commoditized things in the world. So what we did is we identified um, Argentine expats in the C-level and or high-level marketing positions in these companies, and we use that as the way in. And we sent a message, sort of to the effect of, "Hey, I saw we have a common connection, Argentina. I wanted to reach out. We're this agency. We're doing this, that, and the third. I'd love to. It looks like you're doing compelling work at Acme. Wanted to learn more about what you're up to." And from that, that's now a situation where we're getting 5, 10 meetings a week, going after these big companies. And the reason it's happening is just psychological, because when somebody's getting that message, they're thinking rather, this person sat down, he's done his research on me, and I'm willing to give this person my time because they're kind of part of my tribe. Like they're part of my world. So I think that psychological hook is never going to go away. Like the idea of you being able to identify somebody that's in your world and giving them time, and that's really all it takes. Like it's just building that relationship. So that's what we're focused on, and that's kind of how we're thinking about it.
So you get a client and you look for some unique commonality that you can bond with the prospects to get them to engage, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the tricky thing is doing it at scale, because that's really where the long-term meetings and the volume comes from, and the closed business. And that's where, yeah, we have a lot of proprietary stuff we're doing, a lot of proprietary tech. But what that tends to look like is us scraping data all over the place. So instead of just like doing what most people are doing, which is buying a list somewhere, there's issues with that. For one, the data can be old, so people are bouncing around so much, especially now there's so much attrition. But also, it's not really coupled with a strategy that's meaningful and that it's going to compel somebody to want to talk to you. And we see that happening so much, where everybody's just like, yeah, I can just go buy a list of CMOs and hit them up and see, that's just gotten to be less and less effective. So what we're doing is drawing from a lot of different wells, and doing it in real time, so with very few exceptions. We don't have like an old database that's collecting dust. It's more about us building a custom strategy and then getting our clients, getting them in with the right in, basically. If that makes sense.
So you have bots or something scraping specific information. You're potentially pulling it in, maybe some based on some other feeds. And from that, you're then leveraging that data against your strategy and potentially testing out some of your theories.
Exactly. Yeah, and it tends to work well, because what we want is that effect when somebody receives the message, they think, okay, this person actually sat down and wrote me a custom message, and we're sending people the types of letters that they're not typically getting, that very few people are actually taking the time to write. So that's how it's able to produce so many meetings. But I don't want to just make this a pitch for hiring us. I think that even if you're DIYing this, if your listeners are out there trying to do their own outreach, it's definitely heading more towards personalization, to smaller lists, and I think more creativity. Starting with thinking about who might be likely to talk to you. Maybe you're in a trade association. Maybe you're looking at fellow college alums. Maybe the list goes on. But heading along those lines, I think is becoming a lot more effective than just trying to make a case for your service and kind of making like a deeper funnel pitch too soon, if that makes sense.
So that spawns a couple of questions. One is maybe some top level, like, commonalities, right? You mentioned one, which is a country. You mentioned another one, which is a trade show. And then my other question would be is, what's an example of a message? Because I think some people that are prospecting would be in fear of being like too basic or too disingenuous in that outreach, which might be an unfounded fear, right? And just might be that story we're telling ourselves. So can you answer those two questions?
Yeah, I might have missed the first one, but I'll definitely get the second one. So let me know
Forgive
if I'm
me when my
lost in the
shitty
sauce
interviews
here.
that's all on me. I didn't want to forget him.
No, it's okay. So with, yeah, it's a fair concern, and I think that it really depends on our clients' goals, and everything that we write is going to be custom to them and their personality. And I think if you're doing this for yourself, obviously that will be the case. But what we've found is that even if we are lighter on the messaging and we say less about, what we're selling, pretty much everybody we reach out to and connect with knows it's for business purposes. They know that what the person wants, they know they have sales in mind. And then what we recommend to our clients, and I think what our better clients do, is just to be brutally honest, to just connect as humans and say, look, and a lot of the times we're taking an indirect path. Like if we find that we don't want to just beat our heads against the wall trying to get to the CMO all day if there's not a meaningful connection. So maybe we're getting somebody on with the head of HR or CTO. And in those situations, what we tell our clients to do is basically say, hey, I want to be brutally honest with you. I'd love to find a way to partner with your company. Can you help me out? And so, as opposed to like being snaky or trying to find some hide your intentions, just doing that can work wonders. And most people will say, yeah, let me refer you on. But even if you can't get referred on, even if you just have that connection, you can still use that. We have modules on this where we say, look, if you have a good connection with the CTO, hitting up the CMO and saying, hey, I had a really great conversation with your CTO last week. Thought I'd take a chance to reaching out. Here's what we're up to. Would you like to talk? Now you're in a completely different ballpark where that person's going to be much more likely to talk to you. So I think that, as long as you're talking to people at a high enough level, obviously not interns or something, in the right companies, good things are going to happen. So we're big believers in maintaining that activity, that sort of that volume, in order to make sure that things are going in the right direction, basically.
What are some home run win commonalities to build that initial likability, that initial, yeah, I'll talk to this person?
Yeah. So there's probably a few dozen things that we've tried in the past, and there's not one that works for everybody. But I think a lot of them, honestly, seem kind of basic, but very few people are taking the time to actually research these things and then follow up with people over email. I think the channel matters a lot too. Like if you're, pulling some piece of data that's imminently accessible, like, hey, saw you were founded 5 years ago, or you just got funding on Crunchbase, and then you're just doing that on like a LinkedIn. That's a little bit different than if you are taking time to write a certain type of message that reads more like the tone of a message that you might get after you've connected with somebody, like at a networking event back when that was a thing we could do. So anyway, to answer your question, other things that we've tried are looking at account experience. So we might, like, if our clients have worked for a giant account, like it's Coca-Cola, let's just say, then we can identify people that used to work there that have since moved on to other companies that our clients can work with and say, hey, we've done a lot of work with Coca-Cola. Saw you were there. Looks like you're doing compelling work now. Here's what we're up to. Would love to, would it make sense to connect? That, like, even just phrasing it like that, just a little bit further back, a little bit more tasteful, just it sends a different type of message. And what we tend to see is like some of those most common responses that we see are like people saying like, I never respond to this sort of thing, but there's something different about this, so I thought I'd take a chance at it. So I think that's important. And yeah, I could probably go on, but that's one that comes to mind.
Okay. Yeah. And I think just somebody that's DIYing this, most people start there and fail, and then they, go and hire an expert, it seems like. I think that's a great way to go about it, just so you understand what's involved and the value. So if somebody
Yeah.
were starting out today prospecting, going to DIY this thing, what would you recommend to them?
Yeah, great question. So I think that there's going to be work no matter which way you cut it in order to create the sort of personalization that you need to get meetings. So the question is just where the work lives. What most people are doing is they're having the work live in terms of like positioning and creating like really complex funnels and drip sequences and all that, and then playing a numbers game with that. And I think that that's gotten less effective for technical and psychological reasons I could talk about for a long time. So to answer your question, I think that if somebody's DIYing this, a lot of it's about simplifying the channels, and really maybe you're just starting over email. It's just a simple right words to the right people. Don't worry as much about like the drip sequence and this sort of thing yet. But really thinking about, okay, I want to make a list of whatever, 100 people that that I'm super well connected with and that are likely to talk to me in my field. So I think really simplifying it and putting the work more about the prospect identification, as well as writing, a really tasteful message, is the important thing. And from there, another thing that I like to kind of like harken back on is that for some reason, especially in the agency world, agencies are really like down to go crazy for their clients. They're down to come up with really weird, Seth Godin purple cow ideas and throw everything at the wall. But for themselves, like everybody seems to be looking for like a step-by-step checklist. So I would say like, throw it on its head, like stop looking for the checklist as much and just kind of put some of that same creative energy to yourself. So maybe you're writing a funnier message, maybe you're, doing something that you haven't seen as many salespeople do in the past to go after those people that are already kind of connected with you in areas that, where you can do really well and so on.
Would you say the best outreach platform is? Would you say LinkedIn saturated? Is cold email still good? What do you prefer?
Yeah, good question. So I hate to say like XYZ is dead. I think there's probably somebody making passenger pigeon work right now, It depends who you're going after. I think that if you're selling to like roofers that are running around between job sites or something, probably outbound or LinkedIn is not going to work as well. Our experience is more focused on, going after like mid to large companies. So in that world, email, LinkedIn, phone can all be effective. Then there's the whole inbound world of ads and ABM and all that stuff. Again, I think it's contextual a little bit. I do think LinkedIn has gotten harder, and it's gone from being it's gone from maybe middle of funnel back to top of funnel because it's the barrier to getting somebody to agree to speak to you from like a LinkedIn request has probably gotten harder overall. It doesn't mean there's not exceptions. There's just so much more noise on that channel than there was before. So I do think that email is anti-fragile in a way because nobody owns it. Once you get used to doing it and building lists and doing outreach, it's something that you can kind of do forever. There, while deliverability has gotten harder, it's also a good thing because we get less spam and so on. And at the end of the day, in order for email to function, if you really think about it, you're going to have to be able to send a message to somebody you don't know. Otherwise, email doesn't work. So in that way, I don't want to, forever is a long time, but I think that it's only gotten stronger. Like email is something that is not going away, and it's something that you can own. Like we've seen changes happen every 5 minutes to every social media platform. It used to be if you had a Facebook group, you actually could broadcast content to them, and now it's basically a pay to play model for the most part. I've heard rumblings about LinkedIn going the same way and it becoming a lot like Facebook and just almost or 80% pay to play. So I'm a big believer in owning, your own outreach channels. So that's why I think email is still a really good place to play, basically.
Okay. So, and then where do you think phone comes into that mix?
Yeah, I think phone has a lot of similarities with email in the same way. I think that for our world, which is kind of like white collar, bigger ticket sales, it's gotten harder as an immediate like first touch outreach channel because of the same reason that we get spam calls all the time and we don't answer them. I think that it can offer kind of um, a layer of personality, and it can probably play really well with other things. At the moment, for our campaigns, we haven't had a huge need to introduce the phone just because it kind of cuts against the sort of like looser nature of the outreach that we're doing, where it's sort of like, I'm busy, you're busy, I saw we have a connection, let's talk. If we're then following up as somebody else on the phone, it does that psychology breaks a little bit. So it's not something we do a lot of right now, but I think the phone can absolutely work really well.
What would you say what are decent response rates?
Yeah, it's funny because we've actually not divorced ourselves from it, but we've pulled back a little from looking at response rates, and we look more at meeting rates now. So the main metric we're looking at is how many meetings in a given week and how did they go, basically, with our clients. So I would recommend that too if you're DIYing it, because I think it's really easy to kind of get lost in the sauce with metrics when they can be really contextual. I think if you are going to pay attention to metrics, the bigger one's open rate. And I think that a lot of the times we see people messing with subject lines and like A/B testing parts of the beginning of a message, when really open rates become a measure of deliverability. So I'm speaking in broad strokes, and this can really vary, but if you're going, much further below like a 30% open rate, it's not definite, but it's possible that you're just going to spam, or that your messages are not going, where you think they are. And I think that that's become, it's a good thing for what we do, and it's a good thing overall because it means that we're getting less spam. But that's the bigger thing to look at, is more so open rate and meeting rate, I think.
What platforms do you recommend for the DIYers?
Yeah, we have a lot of stuff that we built ourselves, but I think if you're DIYing this, there's lots of good ones. If you're doing this in a team-based format and you have like different pods focusing on different verticals, there's one that my buddy Lee runs called Airborne app that's really good. So I do like that. I'm not making anything on it. I just like to plug his business. And so the Airborne's really good. We've used reply.io in the past. I think that there's a bunch of others. Limlist, I hear good things about. The main thing is you want to be using an outbound platform, and make sure you're not using like a Mailchimp or something like that for doing outbound, and that's for a lot of technical reasons. So those are a few that come to mind.
What are the hell no's? I can't believe people are still trying that because it doesn't work.
Yeah, great question. I think a lot of it, kind of comes down to just the tone of messages, and the too much of a shotgun approach, not really focusing on who you're talking to, and being too vague, with what you're selling and who you're selling it to. Um, when you do that, the problem is, and this is kind of going down a rabbit hole of deliverability stuff. The way it works is, if enough people click that manual spam button, then your domain might be toast, and you might not be able to get messages through for a while. You kind of go into this purgatory. So I think that throws a wrench in the gears more than other things. So I think it really just stems back to just people playing too much of a numbers. Yeah, it still is a numbers game. Volume matters, but you don't want to turn that knob up way too high. Personalization is more important. So you want to kind of get it to a dynamic where even if somebody might not want to talk to you right now, they're at least not mad at it. They're like, oh, I'm okay with you being in my inbox. That's kind of what you're going for. So with that, there's all sorts of violations. I wish I had some funnier examples, but they kind of escape me right now. I think it's mostly just going too hard in the paint. And also like just the tone of like, look, do you have 15 minutes? I think that is less effective, than thinking about, does it make sense to talk? I think that's kind of a better question. And one exercise that's really helpful if you're DIYing this is come up with something that's tasteful, and then go to your spam box and read through like 20 messages, and then make sure it doesn't look like those, make sure it looks visibly different. A lot of the times with subject lines, we're not getting weird. We're saying, hey, intro between me and you, or like something that's very clear and genuine, not really masking any intentions or anything like that.
Right. Cupcakes and shotguns.
Yeah, I would open that sounds pretty cool, but yeah.
So you mentioned the getting your URL spammed. Are you a believer in, let's say your company is Acme Co. Would you buy the URL Acme Co's, and that's what you set your email campaign out on to make sure that you don't get blacklisted?
Yeah, I think that's kind of just standard best practice at this point, just in case, even if you're doing everything perfectly, you never know, and you don't want to jeopardize your main domain.
Got it. Now, as far as the amount of companies that are claiming to do this versus being good at it, I guess what is a separator if somebody's to hire a company to do this? What should somebody look for?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the domain expertise is important, maybe not so much in terms of what you say, because I think sales is sales is sales. We're dealing with human psychology. That matters a little bit less. I think it matters more in terms of the types of companies that are being targeted, right? Where in the agency world, somebody is, like going after, like we have clients in direct TV. So I know from doing this, or rather direct response, commercials. So I know from doing this long enough that they need to go after certain high lifetime value customer. We're not selling to the chips and CPG companies, for example. I think a lot of a lot of like lead generation companies out there may or may not have that level of market intelligence to know like what makes for a good company. And it's not perfect, we're going to target some companies that might not be the perfect fit, but it's by and large on the money. So I think that, having enough domain expertise to figure out the targeting, so you're not having to like handhold them through the list building and everything like that. And beyond that, I think just the tastefulness of the message, the approach, making sure you feel comfortable with what they're sending and everything like that. For us, just to kind of like shamelessly plug ourselves, we've yet to find anybody that can do what we're doing at scale in terms of the data and identifying people based on those commonalities. So that's our main differentiator.
How much time would you say somebody should be spending on their prospecting?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, of course, it depends on the more the better. Right? If you had like a dedicated role or a dedicated team, even better. That's where we're looking to be. So, in a perfect world, 40 hours a week, but you work with what you have, right? So, I think that if you're in a boutique agency or whatever, any company, and you're an owner, an executive, or you're in a split role where you're balancing sales and client service, it may be that you're budgeting, what like a couple hours a day to calls, and then maybe 1 or 2 hours a week, maybe you have a certain day and time where you're doing follow up and you're basically reaching back out to people that are prioritizing, bottom of pipeline, and then going back up to the person you talked to 60 days ago where the timing wasn't right and that sort of thing. And I think that whole pipeline work, like that process, is pretty tough to automate. Yes, there's little shortcuts. You might be able to do a mail merge with a bunch of people every so often, but you're not just going to like click a button and have that machine take over. It takes somebody budgeting time to that process. That's probably what I would say.
How many follow-ups would you say one should have before they just say, okay, this isn't happening?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's funny, like with our approach, we're not as follow-up centric. At least before somebody's built the relationship, at the cold stage, we typically won't do like a drip sequence or a whole bunch of follow-ups because of the nature of our approach, which is much more one-to-one relationship building. And if you're constantly following up, it kind of like you kind of lose the consistency of that. So I don't know if I have a specific number in terms of like cold follow-ups, but what I tend to think of it more as just at least have a filter that tells you, okay, this person hasn't been contacted in 30 days. And then you're thinking of a new campaign or a new way in. Maybe you're giving them content or inviting them on a webinar, but at least have something that's simple and tells you when that person, how long that person hasn't been touched. And internally for our processes is 30 days. So there's something that tells our team, okay, this person hasn't been contacted. Is there a meaningful reason to reconnect? Do we have new work we can talk about? Has something changed on their end that we know about? Do we have a virtual event? Do we have a webinar? Do we put out something cool or interesting, podcast, whatever? And thinking of it more in terms of that sort of bespoke process as opposed to 5 touch points and then they're gone or something like that. I do think there's a place for that. I just don't know if it lives at the level of like bespoke kind of high ticket sales where you're in a boutique agency. I think that lives with bigger sales teams where they have so much data and they really can drill in on those numbers. But I think for us and our clients, it's usually a little bit more of a bespoke process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's just looking at for kind of just, I don't even know if it's best practices, just guidelines, right? When somebody's just trying to get the car in gear.
Yeah.
Now, let's say, and I asked about the response rates. You mentioned meetings. Let's say that they have we got the DIYer. She's doing 100 outreaches she's got a list of 100, right? She's working that list. How many meetings should she expect if she's doing everything right and she's connecting with them on a personal level and she has a strong message? Like, what would you be like? I'm not surprised she got.
Yeah, yeah. I think, to kind of put a number to it and be less coy, I think probably like a 2 to 4% meeting rate's pretty good. Like if you got a list of 100, you should at least be scraping up, a handful of meetings, two to four from that. Assuming you've got a good way in and, people are reading the message and then there's other stuff that is going to be based on your offer and just the nature of your market and those sort of things. Yeah.
And then, like, how long does it usually take from outreach? Because I'm sure there's maybe one follow up in there, maybe a second. So let's say somebody gets their whole campaign, they're rip roaring, and they have no revenue. They're going to go out of business. Is this something that they could employ and be successful within a month?
Not only could they employ it, I think it's the main strategy that you should use. If you're about to go out of business, you're in crisis mode or something. You want to think about, okay, well, first and foremost, you want to. And I know I'm losing your question a little bit, but if for the person that is in crisis mode, your first place is the people that are already paying you or have paid you. That they're likely to pay you again. So that's the closest orbit, and then outwards from there are the people that might have paid you in the past, and then they dropped off, and then it's your personal networks, the people that you already know. And then beyond that is kind of what we're talking about here, which is the people you might not know. They're in the next orbit out, but they're likely to have a connection to you, even if I'm not necessarily just saying LinkedIn second degree or something like that, but people that have some commonality with you is the next most likely group. So I think that's where you should put your energy. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I like that. And it's funny, one of those things when people are their back is against the wall and they got to make sales. And the big advice I give them is you got to do everything you got to do, and that
Yeah.
usually is picking up the phone and calling everybody you know.
Yeah, but for sure, it's that, and it's probably deprioritizing what we're doing now, the longer term, inbound stuff. That stuff's great, but you should always be putting pennies and quarters into the piggy bank there. But if you're in crisis mode, yeah, it's about picking up the phone. It's about like shaking some trees and so on. Yeah.
Now, when it comes to agencies, a lot of them there's a fair amount that are becoming more niche and they're going that way. But let's say that it's not a niche focused agency. What are your tips for them? Is it case studies? Is it just the personalization? Like, where would you dig in to help them out?
Yeah, so I think it is getting tougher for unspecialized agencies, and I think I've sort of changed my thinking on this. I used to say niched as well, and now I think of it more like in terms of specialization, where an agency might have like a handful of verticals they work with, but there is a through line between those verticals. Maybe it's finance and medical and high compliance, or it's growth stage consumer brands, but there is a through line, or they're specialized, and or by service, maybe it's influencer or whatever, media, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that if none of the above applies to you, and you really are just this sort of journeyman agency bouncing around, that's fine. I just think, just know that it's going to be tougher to build scalable new business channels. And we have talked to agencies in that world. We can't usually help them, and they're like, "This is what I want to do," and I'm just like, "Okay, just know what you're getting into." So I think that really is the foundation for everything, is really figuring out that specialization, and then from there, everything else becomes a lot easier. I think in terms, to get tactical, like if a client of ours is a little bit more agnostic in terms of who they can work with, then we can always kind of like specialize them by way of the copy, and I think that can really help a lot. Just having a part of your copy that says, hey, we tend to be a fit for these types of companies, or companies at this stage. Let me know if it makes sense to talk right now. And that can go a long way. That can actually just having a little bit of pre-qualification in the email after you've established that connection can actually get you more calls than if you didn't have it, even if people aren't quite at that stage yet. So it's something worth mentioning.
Where are you seeing oversaturation in specialization, where it's almost pointless to reach out because everybody is either reaching out or that market is just flooded over?
Ooh, yeah, that's tough. Well, I think that there's areas where that are hurting because of the situation. Obviously, like in-person events are struggling really badly, and I think that the ones that hang in there are the ones that are going to have a moat around them, which is the once this is over. So there's some obvious stuff like that. I think that web design, development, creative services is always is tough. That said, I think that um, there's also companies that have huge advantages there, just based on the case studies and based on specialization. So I don't know. I wouldn't say that there's just like disciplines that are oversaturated. I think the problem is what's oversaturated is the sort of like agnostic agency that just does anything and everything for anyone. I think that overall is saturated. I think that anybody that is willing to sort of like put their flag up and say, this is where we do business, this is where we don't, is gonna be stronger for it. There's risk in that too. Like if you niche down to restaurants at the beginning of whatever last year or something, that was a bad move and now you might be in real trouble. But I think the risk of doing nothing is a more definite, is a bigger, more legible risk rather.
Agreed. Now, what about areas where there might be some low hanging fruit where you're surprised that there's not as many people in those specific markets?
Amazon. Amazon.
Really?
That's yeah. There are precious few agencies that understand like really how to deal with Amazon, and and we're talking to a lot of them. It's a big focus for us right now, but the challenge is a lot of the times that working in that space requires you to become like a consultancy where you're dealing with inventory, you're dealing with we can't just sell the heck out of our client because then they'll run out of inventory and then Amazon will slap them down, and there's all sorts of things, and it's a completely different ecosystem, and the same things that exist outside of it are going to exist on it. But there's precious few agencies that get that. So I think that if you're already in that world, it's something to think about.
Good. I think that's a solid takeaway. Now, all right, let's say you have the prospecting done. You went over a bunch of fantastic ways to go about that. How should one run a meeting?
Good question. So I think that if you've survived on referrals and personal networks, I think the first thing to know is that this is going to be different. Unless you get lucky, most of the time you're going to be contacting somebody at an earlier stage. So it's really about, I think this is stuff that I've had to go back to as a salesperson and revisit a lot. It's stuff that you have to constantly remind yourself of. Is just maintaining that process. But the biggest thing that I've learned personally is just really setting expectations and saying, look, here's what we're going to cover on this call. You might leave with more questions than answers. Just kind of heading off trouble with the past and letting people know, here's what we typically do. Like you're going to have all we need to figure out. Here's the decision that needs to be made at the end of this. So I think that doing outreach is really like an excuse to tighten up your process and maybe develop that process for a first time. And it's something that you're going to have to experiment with. It's going to be different depending on your offer and everything like that. But really being able to like set the stage and let people know what to expect when, I think, is the most important thing. Yeah,
I agree, and I think a lot of people don't realize that what channel the lead came in from has a different process for that meeting.
right.
Because if it's the referral, it's warm and it's fuzzy. It's like, oh, Dan, I know Dan. I love Dan. Dan's a great guy. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Versus the person comes in, it's like, yeah, you outreached to me and you pointed out some things that were wrong on my website. It's this totally different vibe, and then you have to play into that. And I love the tip that you gave, where it's providing essentially the agenda, right? And then what I call it is what I want to have happen. So I'll tell them, all right, at the end of this call, this is what I want to have happen. Either we're going to go to that stage or you're going to say no, and you're going to filter yourself out, and we're golden.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that one thing that I've had to remind myself of is the quality of the questions that you ask is actually doing a lot of the selling for you. Being able to ask people good kind of industry specific questions does a lot more than almost anything else. So I think even if you are, reaching somebody through outbound, you still can set it up in a way where they're answering the questions on that first call most of the time. And that's probably what should happen, because you need to understand their situation before you start going down this or that rabbit hole, basically.
So in your service, do you do anything after that initial meeting, or is that essentially handed over to the company where they're on their own at that point?
So for most intents and purposes, yeah, the main part of our job ends after the handoff. That said, we do have lots of content we're putting out there, and materials, and meeting with clients and helping them kind of get ahead of that process. I think that there's probably some exceptions, but for most cases, when you're talking about like a complex big ticket sale, it's pretty much an in-house thing, just based on everything that needs to happen there. For selling like drums of oil or something, maybe that would be different, but yeah.
What about So like, let's say like, what is the like the prospecting kit look like? What would somebody need to make sure that they were able to take this by the horns and then run with it? Is it X number of emails, this list, 2 blog posts? Like, do you have a collection, I dare say package, but something to give somebody an idea of what they would need to be armed and dangerous?
Yeah, well, since you asked, I'll shamelessly plug our course, because
There you
that
go.
probably,
All right, let's do
there we
it.
go. Yeah. I'm not afraid to sell. So that's if anyone's curious, it's salesschema.com/course launch, one word. But maybe we can link it up and stuff. So there is a lot there. I think that, even if there's other free stuff on our site, we have webinars and that sort of thing to go further into this. But I think the main thing you want to look at for now, even if nobody wants to do that, is thinking about Sales Navigator, even if you're not literally using that for the data. That is a really helpful tool to kind of put a name and a face to your prospect for very little cost. And I think that that's kind of just like having a hammer now, is having Sales Navigator. So you probably want that. An outbound email platform is pretty useful, like the ones I mentioned earlier. And honestly, from there, there's lots of different ways to think about the data and to go about getting it. There's lots of different list sources that can be of very good or very questionable quality. I think the bigger thing to think about is more, okay, who am I selling to? Who's likely to talk to me based on a connection? And then once you have that, then think about the scraper or the list source and that sort of thing, because there could be a lot of different ways in.
Got it. And somebody can just rip roar and go through it. So what would you say most agencies are doing wrong? Is it this? Is it their websites? Like what, fill in that blank. What are most agencies doing wrong?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just sort of mindset, where sales gets treated as a downtime hobby, that's done out of necessity. Like we just won 3 big projects, so we can't get on sales calls right now. Where it's like, okay, what happens once those end? Do you want to just keep living like this, or do you want consistency? That's really the quick consistency and growth. Even if you don't want to take over the world or grow massively, if you ever want to sell your agency, if you ever want to just be able to choose your clients instead of the other way around, do compelling work and not have this like hair on fire moment every 3 months, it's going to take building that scalable channel, or hopefully a few scalable channels. And to do that, you need consistency. So ideally, maybe you're hiring a company like ours, or if you don't hire us, maybe you're hiring a junior level sales employee, like somebody that is eventually in that seat to do that 40 hours a week or more. But if you're not there yet, it's really about budgeting time and treating it like you're going to the gym. Like this isn't something you get to stop doing just because you're busy or because you're not busy or whatever. It's something that has to be going all the time.
Got it. Now, from not treating it like a hobby and taking it more seriously, outside of your course, what are some other things that you recommend? Is there books or blogs, or how would you recommend someone to educate themselves to become better at prospecting and sales?
Yeah, great question. So there's a lot, lots of good books. I think one of my favorites, and it gets brought up a lot, is the Challenger Sale. I think it's a really good, simple kind of like 2.0 sales approach. If you're familiar with Sandler and spin selling and all the greats, it's sort of just like, I almost think of it as just the reboot of that, where it's like, okay, like you can't just sell the way that things were done 30 years ago, where you're just asking people a gazillion questions and you don't really understand where they're coming from. You've got it's kind of about the idea that what they say is like teach, tailor, and take control. So I think that's better for the sort of environment that we're in now, where there's more information parity. You know about more about your prospect, they know a good amount about you, and it's sort of just, can I teach you something and kind of be a thought leader and bring you in? So I think that's a really good approach. I think for copywriting, and this probably applies beyond sales. This goes into just the advertising world in general. There's an old book called Breakthrough Advertising by Gene Schwartz, and that's one of my favorites. It's just like, it's biblical level, like longevity. It's just sort of, it talks about the skepticism and the different market cycles, and where it's timeless stuff. So it's hard to get your hands on. I think it's like a
Is
few
that like a
$400.
$400 book?
It's a $400 book. Yeah.
Yeah.
I bought it for a friend who helped me out on a project for a while. So I have actually purchased it. But you can find it floating around online. Maybe it's kind of one of these like legendary books.
I think a guy, if I'm not mistaken, got the rights from the dude's wife after he passed on, and he's still selling it for like 400 or 500 bucks.
Oh wow, yeah. Well, I don't know how he pulled that one off, but good for him, I guess.
Oh man. All right, right on. And what about prospecting though? Are there any prospecting books or any places that you recommend where people can stay on the bleeding edge, if not the cutting?
Yeah. It's funny because like I'm always going back to old stuff, so I'm always less privy to like the bleeding edge as I should be probably. So there's always new gadgets and tech products coming out. A lot of people are doing things with like personalized videos, and there's a lot going on there. So I wish I had a better rec, but I think it's better to actually like counterintuitively stay a little bit further away from the bleeding edge and more go towards old stuff and being creative and, and that sort
I'm
of
the
thing.
same way, man.
Yeah.
Flawlessly execute the basics, and you'll
Yeah.
always be doing all right. The except for the syntax and my wording there. The
Yeah. I got
is as far as I just lost my train of thought for a second. Um, where the hell was I going with that? Sorry, I didn't have lunch.
I do the same thing.
And I'll edit this part out.
No
Maybe
problem.
not, depending on my editor if he's mad at me or not.
That's funny. He's like, no, I'm not going to edit that part out. Just me.
Yeah. The All right. So we got books, we got fundamentals. Oh, the video. That's what I want to talk about. You mentioned video. So how do you feel about video? I know a lot of people are using these now. Like, what is your opinion? Is it just you're getting good results without it? Tell me where you stand.
Yeah, agnostic. I wish I had a better answer for you. To be honest, we haven't incorporated it a lot into our strategy, but I've heard good things. It makes sense that it would work. I think that if especially if it's truly personalized, I'm sort of skeptical about the longevity of just like a semi-personalized video. But it definitely adds. There's something about a human face that's just always going to have a connection. Just that's kind of built into our wiring. So it makes sense that it would work. And I would say, yeah, give it a shot if it's something that you're thinking about.
Yeah, I just don't understand. And I guess I always look at, all right, what's going to happen with this, right? So I'm just thinking, all right, if I'm a CTO of an enterprise level company, and then there is this link that keeps pinging our email server because these companies are trying to serve us an email. I'm like, all right, well, I'm just going to block all those emails, right? And granted, the technology is going to have to advance to that. But that's the moment I saw that, I said, like, yeah, I could literally filter these if those ever
You
come in.
can, yeah, and I think that it is getting tougher to send links and other stuff through email, especially when it's cold. So that's a big reason. That one of the big reasons we like just kind of a warmer textual approach, at least for the first one. So I think if you are going to use video, it might be maybe you're using it as a follow up to people that have already opened or something like that, just to get tactical. But yeah, I mean, I think it could work. It just depends how you're doing it.
Now, what have I not covered that you think the world should know? Is there anything that I missed that we should talk about?
I think great questions overall. I would just say that I think one of the biggest challenges that we help our clients work through is just like who to hire when and the sales team and that sort of thing. They're not easy questions. So I think thinking more about like who's doing what. If you're DIYing this or it's just you, that's maybe the way it is for a little while. If you're kind of thinking about, okay, I want to hire a sales role, I think there's a lot of ways to do it right. I think one common mistake that we see is trying to hire that driver too soon before you have the car built. That typically looks like I'm going to go hire the 6-figure closer, and then you get a bunch of interviews, you talk to a bunch of really good salespeople that convince you to hire them because they're salespeople, and then after a few months, that person often does not work. And we've heard a repeat of that so many times with kind of bigger agencies, especially, where they're like, yeah, we've hired like 3 salespeople, it didn't work out, I guess everybody sucks. And the reality is, like, maybe you've hired some people that suck, but really what's happened is that person is used to selling within an institution where they have support, they have maybe leads teed up, they have a process, and they have a culture, and they slot into that. When you've gotten used to selling mostly just referrals and personal networks, like you've never really had to build that process yet. So that's the thing you want to figure out first is, how am I building the machine? How am I teeing up leads? What's the sales process look like? And then once you've gotten that consistent, then you're hiring that closer basically. So I'd say that's an important thing to keep in mind. Yeah.
No, I think that's a great point. That I've noticed that a lot of agency owners will just bring on a salesperson and expect magic to happen, where they don't understand that there has to be tracks laid, an entire infrastructure created so this person can be successful. And like, oh well, they just didn't do their job. It's like it's
Yeah.
supposed to be just this rainmaker. So no, I appreciate you adding that. And I guess what should somebody look for in a salesperson?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think that I- I'm not the most experienced sales hire. I've done it a bit, so there's still a lot that I'm learning. But what I found to be helpful is just the stuff that you can't teach. So obviously, like poise on the interview, follow up. Did they send a simple thank you note? That's the sort of thing that you can't really like remind somebody to do, but if they don't do it, it's sort of disqualifies them. So I think like not making people jump through arbitrary hoops, but looking for disqualifiers. Like, do you have more energy after talking to them or less? Are they draining you? So the stuff that's impossible to teach and just qualifying people out. And then from there, I'm kind of more of a believer in just testing people and paying them and seeing how things actually pan out, because there's only so much you're going to learn from the interviews and that sort of thing. But that said, to talk about another book, I think that Mark Roberge's sales acceleration formula. He was like the HubSpot CRO. I think that's a really good like hiring and scaling blueprint. Yeah.
Right on, man. Yeah, I appreciate your time today. If there's anything else that you think the audience should know, your plug, whatever you'd like to fill in this space, this time is yours.
Yeah, thanks, man. Appreciate it. So we have a podcast as well called Digital Agency Growth Podcast. If anybody's in that world and interested, site saleschema.com. And again, if anybody's interested in the course, saleschema.com/course launch.
Awesome. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today, man.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, great questions. Really appreciate it.